On the evening of November 14th, 1957, a line of expensive cars wound slowly through the quiet roads of Appalachin, New York. The trees had already surrendered most of their leaves, and a cold wind swept across the hills surrounding a large country estate. From a distance, it looked like nothing more than a gathering of wealthy businessmen visiting an old friend. But something wasn't right. Local residents noticed unfamiliar luxury Cadillacs with license plates from New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and even Florida. Men in expensive suits stepped out one by one. They spoke quietly. They avoided eye contact with strangers. Every arrival was carefully watched by someone already inside the property. Behind the closed doors of that house, some of the most powerful mafia bosses in America were preparing to make decisions that could reshape organized crime for an entire generation. They believed they were invisible. They believed no one was watching. They were wrong. Just a few miles away, New York State Police Sergeant Edgar Croswell had been paying attention for weeks. The unusual traffic, the expensive cars, the whispers around town. Something about that mansion had been bothering him. That afternoon, he decided to find out why. Within hours, one routine police checkpoint would trigger absolute panic. Men who had ordered murders without hesitation suddenly abandoned their cars and sprinted through muddy fields. Others crashed through fences in polished leather shoes. Some disappeared into nearby forests, hoping the darkness would protect them. Their expensive suits became soaked with rain and dirt as the illusion of untouchable power collapsed around them. For decades, America's mafia had operated like a hidden government. Politicians denied its existence. Law enforcement struggled to prove it. The bosses preferred shadows over headlines. Then, in a single afternoon, those shadows disappeared. It wasn't a violent war. It wasn't an FBI raid planned for months. It wasn't a rival family's betrayal. It was one mistake. A mistake so simple that none of the most feared men in organized crime saw it coming. And that single mistake would begin the slow collapse of an empire built on fear, silence, and absolute loyalty. Long before the meeting at Appalachin shocked America, the Mafia had already become one of the most powerful criminal organizations the country had ever seen. It wasn't built overnight. It was built one neighborhood, one alliance, and one act of violence at a time. In the crowded streets of New York City during the early 1900s, thousands of Italian immigrants arrived looking for opportunity. Many found honest work. Others found poverty, discrimination, and neighborhoods where the law rarely offered protection. In those streets, respect wasn't earned through elections or business titles. It was earned through reputation. A man's word meant everything. So did his willingness to defend it. Out of those neighborhoods came small gangs that slowly grew into organized families. Protection rackets turned into gambling operations. Gambling expanded into loan sharking. Loan sharking led to extortion. Before long, these groups controlled entire blocks, then entire boroughs. The Underworld had found its foundation. One man understood that future better than almost anyone else. Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Unlike many gangsters of his generation, Luciano didn't believe endless violence was the answer. Violence attracted attention. Attention attracted police. And police threatened profits. Money came first. Everything else came second. Luciano surrounded himself with ambitious young criminals who shared his vision. Among them were men who would eventually become legends in organized crime, including Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, and Meyer Lansky. Each brought something different to the table. Costello understood politics. Genovese inspired fear. Lansky had a brilliant financial mind that transformed criminal profits into sophisticated business operations. Together, they represented a new generation. They weren't interested in neighborhood street fights. They wanted an empire. The opportunity came during the brutal Castellamarese War in the early 1930s. Rival mafia bosses Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano dragged New York's underworld into months of bloody conflict. Gunmen were murdered in restaurants, apartments, and city streets. Every assassination created another cycle of revenge. Luciano watched carefully. He understood something the older bosses refused to accept. If the war continued, everyone would lose. Businesses suffered. Police pressure increased. Trusted soldiers became impossible to replace. The old traditions that demanded absolute loyalty to one powerful mustache Pete were destroying the very organization they claimed to protect. Luciano decided the old system had to end. His decision changed American organized crime forever. First came the murder of Joe Masuria in 1931. Luciano quietly switched sides, helping arrange the assassination of the man he had once served. Only months later, Salvatore Maranzano also fell to assassins disguised as government agents. Within a single year, both old bosses were gone. The bloodshed finally stopped. In their place, Luciano introduced something revolutionary. Instead of one supreme ruler controlling every family, he created a governing body known as the Commission. The most powerful mafia families would settle disputes through negotiation instead of constant warfare. Every family would have territory. Every boss would have responsibilities. Most importantly, everyone would have financial reasons to maintain peace. It wasn't democracy. It was business, and business was booming. The Commission allowed organized crime to spread across America with remarkable efficiency. New York remained the center, but influence reached Chicago, New Orleans, Cleveland, Buffalo, Philadelphia, Detroit, and beyond. Illegal gambling generated millions. Labor unions opened new opportunities. Construction contracts became another source of enormous wealth. Nightclubs, trucking companies, waterfront operations, and waste management businesses quietly came under mafia influence. The public rarely noticed. When they did, they saw successful businessmen wearing expensive suits, donating to charities, and attending church on Sundays. Behind closed doors, however, every handshake carried hidden meaning. Every favor created a debt. Every debt demanded payment. Silence protected everything. The mafia called it omerta, the code that forbade cooperation with authorities. Breaking that code wasn't simply considered betrayal. It was a death sentence. That rule created an organization unlike any other criminal enterprise in America. Witnesses disappeared. Victims refused to testify. Entire neighborhoods remained silent even after shootings happened in broad daylight. Fear became more valuable than bullets. By the 1940s and early 1950s, another powerful figure emerged at the center of this expanding empire: Vito Genovese. Unlike Luciano, Genovese possessed an entirely different personality. He was impatient, suspicious, and deeply ambitious. While Luciano believed compromise protected profits, Genovese believed fear protected power. He wanted more than influence. He wanted complete control. Meanwhile, another boss quietly strengthened his own position without attracting unnecessary attention. Frank Costello. Known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld, Costello preferred conversations over gunfire. He built relationships with politicians, judges, businessmen, and influential public officials. His network reached far beyond traditional criminal circles. Where Genovese inspired fear, Costello inspired loyalty. The contrast between them couldn't have been greater. As Luciano's influence faded following his conviction and eventual deportation, ambitious men began looking toward the future. Who would truly control the mafia? Would diplomacy continue to guide the Commission? Or would violence once again become the language of power? Those questions quietly divided America's most powerful crime families. Every private dinner, every funeral, every wedding, every secret meeting became an opportunity to build alliances or destroy them. By the mid-1950s, Vito Genovese believed his moment had finally arrived. Rivals had weakened, old leaders were aging. Supporters whispered that he deserved to stand above every other boss in the country. But becoming the most powerful man in organized crime required something dangerous: recognition. Recognition meant bringing together bosses from across America. Recognition meant holding a meeting unlike any ever attempted before. And in choosing where and how that meeting would happen, the mafia's greatest leaders unknowingly set in motion the very event that would begin unraveling everything they had spent decades building. None of them realized it yet, but history was already moving toward a quiet country estate in upstate New York, where one overlooked detail would transform America's invisible criminal empire into front-page news, and nothing would ever be the same again. By the fall of 1957, Vito Genovese believed he had finally reached the top. Frank Costello had survived an assassination attempt only months earlier and had quietly stepped away from day-to-day leadership. Albert Anastasia, the feared boss of Murder Incorporated's old generation, had been gunned down inside a Manhattan barbershop in one of the most shocking mob murders in American history. Two of Genovese's biggest obstacles had suddenly disappeared. To many inside the Mafia, it looked like destiny. To Genovese, it looked like victory. But power inside the Mafia was never official until other bosses accepted it. A title meant nothing without recognition. Respect wasn't announced. It was negotiated behind closed doors, often with men who trusted no one but themselves. Genovese wanted that recognition. He wanted every major boss in America to see him as the new center of organized crime. For that reason, a secret gathering was arranged at the country home of Joseph Barbara in the quiet town of Appalachin, New York. Barbara was a respected mafia figure with enough influence to host such an extraordinary meeting. On paper, the event was described as nothing more than a social visit celebrating Barbara's recovery from illness. Nobody outside the organization was supposed to believe anything else. Invitations spread quietly through trusted messengers. No letters, no public announcements, no unnecessary phone calls. Only men with real authority were expected to attend. Bosses traveled from New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, Florida, and several other states. Some drove hundreds of miles in brand new Cadillacs. Others arrived with trusted bodyguards who remained outside the main house. Every guest understood that what happened inside those walls could shape the future of organized crime across America. The conversations were expected to cover everything: leadership disputes, drug trafficking, illegal gambling, labor unions, territorial disagreements, international business. The meeting wasn't simply about celebrating Genovese. It was about organizing an empire that now stretched across the country. Inside the Barbara estate, expensive food covered long dining tables. Cigarette smoke drifted toward the ceiling as powerful men greeted each other with quiet smiles and cautious handshakes. Some hadn't met face to face in years. Others exchanged information that never could have been trusted to a telephone. Every sentence mattered. Every promise carried consequences. Every alliance could change the balance of power. But outside the mansion, someone was paying attention. New York State Police Sergeant Edgar Croswell had become suspicious weeks before the gathering. Joseph Barbara had attracted attention because of his unusual wealth, his known criminal associations, and the steady flow of expensive visitors coming to his rural property. The activity simply didn't fit the quiet farming community. Luxury cars appeared where tractors usually parked. Well-dressed strangers wandered roads normally traveled by local families. Something felt wrong. Croswell couldn't prove it. Not yet. Still, experience had taught him that organized crime rarely announced itself with violence. It announced itself with patterns. He began watching. The more he observed, the more convinced he became that something important was about to happen. On November 14th, the traffic became impossible to ignore. Cadillac after Cadillac rolled toward Barbara's estate. License plates came from multiple states. Neighbors noticed. Police noticed. Curiosity turned into suspicion. Croswell decided to investigate. At first, the officers simply drove toward the property. Nothing dramatic. No massive operation. No army of federal agents. Just a handful of local law enforcement officers asking ordinary questions. Then everything changed. Word spread through the house that police had been seen nearby. For a few seconds, nobody reacted. Surely it was a misunderstanding. Perhaps the officers would leave. Perhaps they knew nothing. Then someone looked through the window. The panic started immediately. Men who had spent decades ordering murders suddenly forgot every rule of discipline. Some rushed toward parked cars, desperate to escape before officers recognized them. Others ran through the back doors without saying a word. Several climbed fences. Some sprinted across muddy fields in polished dress shoes worth more than the average family's monthly income. Expensive hats disappeared into bushes. Documents were abandoned. Cars collided while trying to leave the narrow driveway. The meeting that was supposed to demonstrate perfect control dissolved into complete chaos. Sergeant Croswell watched in disbelief. Respectable businessmen didn't flee through forests. Successful executives didn't abandon luxury cars and run from routine questioning. Only guilty men behaved that way. Officers quickly began stopping vehicles leaving the estate. They asked simple questions. Names, addresses, reasons for visiting. The answers rarely matched. One man claimed he was visiting a sick friend. Another insisted he had gotten lost. Others refused to answer at all. Many carried large amounts of cash. Some gave obviously false identities. Several famous mafia figures found themselves standing beside country roads while local police officers wrote down their information. Photographers soon arrived. Newspapers followed. Within hours, pictures of America's most powerful crime bosses appeared across the country. For decades, many politicians had insisted that a nationwide mafia organization didn't really exist. The Appalachin meeting destroyed that argument almost overnight. The evidence was impossible to ignore. Dozens of high-ranking organized crime leaders from multiple states had gathered in one location. Not for a wedding, not for a funeral, not for business in any legitimate sense. They had come to govern a criminal empire. The headlines exploded. Congress demanded answers. Federal agencies that had previously treated organized crime as a local problem suddenly faced enormous public pressure. Most importantly, one man paid the highest price. Vito Genovese. Instead of being recognized as the unquestioned leader of the American Mafia, he became the man whose ambition had exposed the organization to the entire country. Some bosses blamed the police. Others blamed Joseph Barbara for choosing such an obvious location. But many quietly blamed Genovese himself. They believed his hunger for power had forced everyone into one dangerous gathering. He had wanted recognition. Instead, he had created evidence. The code of secrecy that had protected the mafia for decades had suffered its biggest crack. And cracks have a way of growing. The men leaving Appalachin believed the disaster would eventually be forgotten. They assumed the newspapers would move on. They believed silence would repair the damage. They couldn't have been more wrong, because while they were busy escaping through fields and back roads, another enemy was already studying every photograph, every license plate, and every name collected that afternoon. The FBI had finally been handed exactly what it had needed for years: proof that the American Mafia was real. And once that door opened, it would never fully close. The days following the Appalachin meeting were unlike anything the American Mafia had experienced before. For years, the organization had survived because it lived in the shadows. Most Americans had heard rumors about secret crime families, but rumors weren't enough to force action. Politicians often dismissed the idea of a nationwide mafia network, and many law enforcement agencies focused on local crimes instead of a larger conspiracy. Appalachin changed all of that. Suddenly, there were photographs, license plates, witness statements, police reports. Most importantly, there was proof that powerful crime bosses from across the United States had gathered in one place. The illusion of invisibility was gone. Inside mafia circles, the mood quickly turned bitter. Some bosses believed Joseph Barbara should never have hosted such a large gathering. Others argued that security had been careless from the beginning. But behind closed doors, one name came up again and again: Vito Genovese. His supporters insisted the meeting had simply been unlucky. They argued that no one could have predicted a curious state trooper would connect the dots. His critics saw it differently. They believed Genovese's ambition had blinded him. He had wanted every important boss in America to recognize his authority. Instead, he had gathered them together like targets, handing investigators the strongest evidence they had ever received. In the Mafia, mistakes were remembered far longer than victories. Trust was harder to rebuild than money. While the bosses argued among themselves, the federal government began changing its approach. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who had long been criticized for downplaying organized crime, could no longer ignore what had happened. Investigations expanded. Intelligence files grew thicker. Surveillance increased. Informants became more valuable than ever before. For the first time, law enforcement wasn't chasing isolated gangsters. It was mapping an entire criminal empire. And every new investigation uncovered another piece of the puzzle: illegal gambling operations, labor racketeering, loan sharking networks, political corruption, hidden alliances that had remained secret for decades. The empire was still powerful, but it was no longer invisible. Vito Genovese himself would not enjoy his victory for long. In 1959, he was convicted on federal narcotics charges and sentenced to prison. Whether the case was built entirely on solid evidence or strengthened by enemies eager to see him fall has been debated for decades. But the result was undeniable. The man who dreamed of ruling the mafia spent the rest of his life behind bars, where his influence steadily faded until his death in 1969. His empire survived. His legacy did not. Appalachin wasn't the day the mafia died. Far from it. The five families continued operating for decades, and powerful bosses would rise again. Men like Carlo Gambino would build influence through patience rather than spectacle, proving that quiet leadership often outlasted public ambition. But the rules had changed forever. One careless gathering had exposed an organization that depended on secrecy above everything else. The greatest lesson wasn't that the mafia could be defeated overnight. It was that even the most powerful criminal empire could be weakened by a single moment of overconfidence. In the end, bullets didn't expose the mafia. A meeting did. Not a war. Not a betrayal. Just one mistake. And from that cold afternoon in Appalachin forward, America's most feared secret society would never again be truly invisible.